even before we switched to short-term rentals in 2016, things kind of flipped once we got to that 17 units and I had pretty low interest rates, low mortgage payments. We were cash flowing pretty decently. And then when we switched to short-term rentals is when really the cash flow tripled. And it got to the point to where, my wife and I were asking ourselves, why are we working for a paycheck when we've got this going on over here on the side?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'd love to hear what that process was like when you switched, because I think some people listening to this have thought about doing this, but they aren't sure it's worth it. It's like, It feels like a big lift. And then, there's what if all of these things go wrong? So can you walk through the process of how you determined that it was worth it for you to convert, and how you kind of, did you do it all at once, or did you test things? What did that process look like?
Yeah. So it's kind of a fun story. It was 2016 again. And I know Airbnb started in like 2008, I think is when they launched, but they weren't big or really well known until maybe 13 or 14. And even 2016, I'd never used Airbnb myself.
Yeah.
And so we actually were flying back from South America. We got to the house that we were going to stay at, which was a friend of ours lent us their house to stay in. And when we walked in the front door at 1:00 in the morning, exhausted after like a 24-hour, travel from our house in Ecuador, we walked in the house. And when I stepped foot inside, I heard a squish. So our house was flooded, or the house we were going to stay at was flooded. So 1:00 in the morning, we shut the water main off and went to a hotel. Right. And so it's a family of 5. We're in a hotel with 2 beds, uncomfortable. The next day we wake up and I'm just a little bit frustrated, mad. And so we got to find a solution. And I think my wife said, well, why don't we just book an Airbnb? Oh, that's a great idea. So I started looking on Airbnb, and in Boise in September of 2016, there were only 3 homes that had 3 bedrooms, and they were all priced at $150 a night or more.
Wow.
And I just started doing the math. How many houses do I have in Boise? And what's my nightly rate, with a $900 rent or whatever. And I just oh my goodness, what's going on? So we rented one of the Airbnbs, and I talked to the host of that and just kind of started picking her brain and basically hired her to flip one of my units from a traditional rent that I actually had a vacancy at that moment, flip it to a short-term rental to test it. It did so well that by the end of the year, I'd flipped all my units over to short term.
Wow. Yeah. So did she become your co-host then that managed?
Yes. At first for about a year. And then I actually, because I still have my property management company that was handling some aspects of it. So I was basically just relying on her for all the new stuff that you deal with for short-term rentals. And after that first year, we kind of got the hang of it, and I decided just to use my property management company to do it. So she was on board for about a year.
I see. Okay. And so you guys furnished them all yourself pretty much. I mean, you yep. used her to help you.
Yeah.
And it worked out right from the beginning. Are there certain lessons you learned going through the process initially that you started to change the process over time?
Yeah. So part of the reason why we decided to bring it in-house is some of those challenges, the same challenges you have with property managers in traditional rentals, right? The motivation of a property owner is just different than a property manager. And so I just made the decision that we need to bring this in-house so that I can set the culture and set the key performance indicators, is the term we use now. What is it that we're going after? And that needs to be what we're aligned with. So, the short-term rental business, and don't be mistaken, it's a business, right? Mm-hmm. Investing in traditional rentals, there's still work that you have to do, and anybody that's in that knows that there's work that you have to do. At least you have to manage the manager. You have to keep an eye on the manager, watch the expenses and all that. Short-term rentals, my accountant still allows us to call that passive income, but that's really not a good description. It's very active. You're hosting, you're more like a hotel than you are a traditional landlord, right? Mm-hmm. And so there's just a lot of dynamics involved. And the success of your short-term rental business is going to be driven by reviews. And reviews are, I mean, you can get a bad review for one hair in the bathtub.
Yeah.
And that happens. And so you just have to get really, really skilled at turning a property after one guest checks out and before the next one checks in. And that's often the same day. So you just got to get really good at that task.
Yeah. And do you feel like you were more involved or it took up more of your time with the long-term rentals or short-term rentals? Not like how much day-to-day work there is to do, but personally what you have to do.
Yeah, great question. Again, I was forced to create my own property management systems in my own company. And I had a full-time job and I was very determined to focus my energy on that job. And so I just didn't have time to focus on the short-term rentals or the long-term rentals. So I did rely on my team. That said, I was more involved, or at least watching the numbers closer. In traditional rentals, you're only really concerned about them when either somebody's not paying their rent or the unit's empty, right? If everybody's paying their rent and your units are full, there's not a whole lot you really need to do. But on short-term rentals, you'll have 4 or 5 guests in a month instead of one for a whole year. And so I was constantly watching my occupancy rates, my average daily rate, and all that kind of stuff, just to make sure that we're on track, especially when we first got started, because I just wasn't sure. It looked like it was good, but is this too good to be true? I wanted to make sure that we were staying full and have enough money to come in to pay the mortgages.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, and I'm a huge advocate for self-management as well for short-term rentals, because with a few key people who can do the boots on the ground activities, I found personally that I actually was more it was more stress and took more time for a less return with long-term rentals, even though it doesn't intuitively seem that way. It seems like, well, there's turnover constantly, so it's going to be a lot more work for you. But if you have a good system in place, it's really not. Do you enjoy short-term rentals or long-term rentals more?
Yeah, I like the challenge of the short-term rental, and I like even trying different photographs to boost bookings. And, something that I've just recently started trying is parent-child relationships. So, for example, I've got 3 townhomes all in the same building. It's 3 separate titles, and I have all 3 units listed in my system. And I've just created a parent listing where it's all 3 townhomes together. So instead of 1 2-bed, 2-bath, or a 3-bath, it's now 6 bedrooms, 9 bathrooms, capacity like 12 people or whatever it is, and listing that as one listing and showing the picture of all 3 of them lined up. And that's actually starting to do really well. So I like the challenge of that you wouldn't have in a traditional rental, where you can be a little more creative and just try to find that competitive advantage against the rest of the units out there.
Yeah, that's a good point. And that strategy, I love that strategy. I've got a few multi-units myself, and I found in the busy season that big, we call it a super listing of all of them together, does phenomenally well because it's big groups traveling. And then in the slow season, you can still rent out to the small groups without having to sacrifice, a huge amount of your revenue. So
exactly.
That's
I
awesome.
I charge just a little premium on that super listing. I like that. I might adopt that terminology. Just a little premium. And so whenever I get one of those bookings, I know I'm ahead. So
yeah, I got that term from Blake Daly, who's a previous guest who does that as well. Cool. Yeah. So one big objection I get though from a lot of people around the short-term rentals is, what aren't guests going to book the property and just destroy it and have parties? Does this happen to you, or what's been your experience?
Yeah, of course we've had that happen. But to keep it into perspective, we've had, I don't know, 5,000 guests now.
Wow.
And of course I remember the 3 really bad events that happened, but not the 4,997, that had no problem. So, I mean, we've called the cops maybe 2 or 3 times since 2016. And to be honest, I've had some long-term tenants that did more damage to our property than any of my short-term tenants. So I think when you enter business, you take risk. And this is one of those risks in short-term rentals. And yes, it can happen, but as the business owner, you need to do everything you can to, one, screen your guests to a reasonable degree. Like we require a government ID and we don't allow an instant book. On Airbnb specifically, you can't instant book if you don't have a prior stay on Airbnb. So you can inquire and then we will check it out. And oftentimes we say no. If we don't have a track record, we're not going to let you in. But Airbnb and the other platforms also have, those liability coverages that typically they do honor. If somebody breaks something or steals something or messes something up, they'll replace it. And if they're booking direct, which is what we really are striving for, direct bookings, I have liability coverages. We have liability in our homeowners policy. I have a liability umbrella policy for my company. Plus we capture a deposit, and we've just never really had a significant loss. We've had some losses here and there, but we've not had a significant loss. So you just need to make sure you're protected from a liability standpoint and do everything you can reasonably to screen the guests before they check in.